Thank you all so much for tuning into my show, William Wallace for America. I am not only grateful for your time, but appreciative that you're spending it with me. And speaking of grateful, we're going to talk to our guest today, who is very grateful about a lot of things that in his book that he wrote about. And I'm kind of doing a little bit of a tongue twister on that for multiple reasons, because while this is going to be somewhat of a spiritual journey my next guest is going to be sharing with us today, there's also some things that I'm going to intertwine because I like talking about faith and freedom and the founding fathers, but also politics. We're going to talk about his book, but we're going to talk about getting his opinion through his experience from his book on things like the books of the Apocrypha, if you know about that. We're going to talk a little bit about, then we're going to jump to things like, did the founding fathers want a true separation of church and state? A unique perspective from somebody who wrote a book about missing books from not only our Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible, or were there lost books, some other things. I'll bring up things like the Ethiopian Bible. And while this might sound like a spiritual journey, which it is going to be one, I think that politics and religion have been intertwined in such a way that we're losing sight of a lot of things, which I think this book is going to bring out. I'm getting all of this because I've had a chance to not only talk with our next guest, but also talk with the person that introduced us about him. So let's go ahead and get started with some of this interesting stuff on lost books and politics and freedom and all the other great stuff that comes from our creator through our DNA, Mark McWhorter. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. God bless. Happy to be here.
Well, what a day to have a spiritual sort of conversation with somebody who's got two biblical names, right?
Exactly. And I truly thank God my mom named me that. If she named me anything else, I might not be here as a Christian today. So luckily I was named after the Bible, and that's what got me to read it late in life. Otherwise, I had not been Christian and had not gone to church or prayed for a long time, but just the name. So if you're wondering what to name your child, can't go wrong with Matthew Mark.
Exactly. Well, and if you really want to get like long about it, they can call their child Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And
I have been bitter my whole life that I didn't have a twin named Luke John, and it's just one of those gaps in my life that just really irritates me.
Well, at least at least then y'all would really know when your mom was really mad at you, because she'd be like, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So you wouldn't know if they're mad at you or she's just calling on all the help from all the apostles to help her with you. All right.
She would probably tell you she needed help from all four. So,
well, Matthew, let's start from the top. What is the name of your book and what is it about? And then we're going to go from there on a lot of the things that not only that you like to talk about, but things that I like to talk about on my show.
Yeah. So the book's called Canon Crossfire, Canon of Scripture, Canon, Canon Crossfire. And the concept is that so to go back on my journey, so my mom, my grandfather had been Catholic. My mom had gone to Catholic schools, and all she really told me was she hated the nuns. So never learned to pray, never went to church, never read the Bible. But late in life, I had cancer and a heart attack within 30 days of each other. And I'm just so lucky to be alive. And as I was recovering from this, people ask me like, what's your bucket list? And I was like, well, Grandpa left me those Western cowboy novels. I guess I got to read them before I die. And oh, by the way, I was named after the Bible. I always wanted to read that. So that was it. I just wanted to go read this book. And as I did, I became much more interested in Christianity. There was just so much to Christianity that I didn't know and didn't understand. And I learned it as I went through this process. But it was kind of a weird way that I'm coming to Christianity. It's just that I'm named after it. So I go out to try to find a Bible. And, my first discovery on Amazon is that there's all these different Bibles. There's a Catholic Bible, there's a Protestant Bible, there's the Orthodox Bible, and the Orthodox do not agree on what the Bible should be. So the different varieties of Orthodox have different Bibles, as do some of the Protestants. And, I was left with this question of what Bible am I supposed to even read, given that I was named after it? And so I sort of found myself dealing with two questions at the same time. And that's where this crossfire comes in, is what is the correct Bible and is Christianity actually true? And it was putting those two questions side by side that I started to realize that I don't think people have examined these two questions in one context to come up with one consistent answer. And most of what I would read was actually very inconsistent between the two stories. As one example, there's a guy named Irenaeus in the very earliest church. He is absolutely crucial to showing us that the four gospels are the true four gospels of Jesus Christ, that all the other gospels are fake, that all four of these are real, but only these four. That's what Irenaeus tells you. He says those four came from the apostles. He also says that a book called Baruch.
What four are real and which ones are not real?
Exactly. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are real, but the other gospels, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, etc., those are fake gospels according to the earliest Christian testimony, etc. So that's crucial to proving that we have four real gospels, and therefore that we can prove that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. But we Irenaeus, the star witness for proving that, also tells you that the book of Baruch came from the apostles, and the book of Baruch is not found in Protestant Bibles, for example. So I got curious of this just as a lawyer, as examining evidence. If Irenaeus is the person telling you about the four gospels, and he's also telling you about Baruch, can you actually prove the case for Christ, given that your star witness has some problems? And that's what my book is really focused on, is this Canon Crossfire, and how do we sort through that and come up with one consistent answer? So that's where my research came in. I just wanted to know I want to know three things about these earliest books, earliest Christians said about these books. I want to know, what did the Jews say? So Catholics and Protestants give us different stories. I researched, what do the Jews say about these books? Second thing was, where in the Bible does the New Testament possibly refer to these books? And I just wanted to read them all for myself, and I couldn't find a book that assembled them all, so I assembled them for others to read. And the third thing is, I wanted to know what all the earliest Christians in the first 450 years ever said about these books that are in Catholic Bibles, but not in Protestant Bibles. So I assemble all of that for someone to find. It's merely this quest to find the evidence that leads to this book. Because as a lawyer, we argue all the time over things, right? But you argue at the end. It's called a closing argument. You start with the evidence. Everyone should know what the evidence is. And what I find is that people argue over these allusions that might be in the New Testament, or they argue over what some of the earliest Christians said. Like, first thing you got to do is find all the evidence and look through it. And that is what I try to do in my book. It's just a more disciplined approach to the question, and presenting all that research for other people, because I couldn't find it. If I could have found it, I wouldn't have wrote the book. I would have bought it. But I couldn't find it, so I assembled it.
This is something that's very interesting to me, Matthew. A lot of people, when they talk about, is Jesus real or not, or the Bible being real, they say, here's the Bible, it says this, boom, done. That settles it, right? Exactly. But you, on the other hand, took it from an attorney perspective, where you said, prove it to me. I want to see I want to see the evidence. And while pastors and preachers and priests could all go, oh no, it says it right here in this book, you went a little bit deeper and found other historical figures of that time, we'll say, with other writings, and used that evidence to kind of say, no, we're going to focus on, these particular things as the evidence that you can hang your hat on. And we're going to go this route right here on proving that. And then from that, you found other things that that most people miss when they read the Bible or they study the history of Jesus at that time. Is that, do I have that right?
Absolutely. And it's a very simple thing to me as a lawyer when I looked at this stuff, but it's because of decades of training. It's kind of the weirdness of how I come to this question and how it fell to me to write this book. But people settle for explanations from what I call a lawyer, but from someone trying to prove their point. They'll say, well, there are these allusions in the Bible, in the New Testament, to these books. And people will say, well, Paul references poetry from the Greek poets. That doesn't prove anything. Like, yeah, maybe not. But a trial is days, weeks, even months of piece of evidence after piece of evidence after piece of evidence. You need to look at all 200. There's at least 200 of these allusions in the New Testament to these books. What you decide to do with them, you decide at the end. But the first thing you do is look at each and every piece of evidence, because when you tell me, well, Paul referred to a poem, What does that prove? Like, well, yeah, but let's see what Paul does with the book of Sirach, for example, which is another one of these books that isn't found in a Protestant Bible. Like, he refers to it in one of his epistles, and then he does it again in a second epistle, and then again in a third epistle, and then again in a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, and an eighth, and a ninth, and a 10th. Well, like, that is 10 different epistles that he refers to the book of Sirach in. That is, you can claim those are just illusions and you don't believe them, whatever. But the question is, can you convince a neutral judge of that at the end when he did it 10 times? You'll find that Jesus refers to the book of Sirach not just multiple times in the various gospels, but he actually refers to it twice in the Our Father prayer. Our Father itself, that you can find references to God as the Father in the Protestant Old Testament, but the first time that anyone ever addresses a prayer to our Father is actually in the book of Sirach. That doesn't come from Jesus. And similarly, the concept that you will be forgiven your debts or your trespasses only as much as you forgive others comes from the book of Sirach. So you have, effectively, you have a book of Sirach that claims that it was divinely inspired. So God inspired it. Then you have God becoming man. And as man, he is referring back to this book that is either lying about being inspired by God or was inspired by God. And he incorporates two key theological concepts from that book, Our Father and the forgiveness only as much as you forgive others, into a prayer that God himself tells us to pray to him for all eternity. I mean, you could just say, well, Paul referred to a poem and confuse a lot of people and get a lot of people to never look at this evidence. But to a lawyer, you start with the evidence and then you give me your explanations later. That's a closing argument, not an initial argument. The illusions are evidence. Let's look at them. Let's break them down. Let's see what they say. There's just so many things when you pour through the evidence that you just don't find explained anywhere. And, one of them, again, this book of Sirach, it's basically almost referred to in the vast majority of books in the New Testament seem to allude to Sirach. But the one book that does the most allusions to Sirach, that seems to almost be devoted to Sirach, is the Epistle of James, who, according to many Protestants, is an actual physical brother of Jesus. It's odd that his own brother would be referring to this book so much. How do you explain that? What is the story? Like that? Those are the things that come up to somebody who reviews the evidence. I'll give you another one, which just comes from the Jewish scholarship. And part of what I'm trying to say to people, I didn't find what I'm about to say in Protestant scholarship, and I didn't find it in Catholic scholarship. I don't think anybody searched through this evidence looking for all the evidence that might relate to this question. That's where I came in as a lawyer. I just rolled up my sleeves and went and did it, and I just want to show it to people. I leave everything to the reader. You figure out where you go from here, but you should know what the evidence is. And one of the examples from Jewish scholarship, the Protestant canon, the first time that you will find a Jewish writing that officially determines the canon is in the book called the Talmud. That book comes centuries after Christ, and the question is, how does that relate back to Christ? So you will find Protestants who say, well, that was the original Jewish canon. That's why we have it in our book. Okay, that's the story. Well, what does the evidence say? Well, if you look into that Talmud, you will find a story called The Woman with Seven Sons that is a very inspirational story about a woman who watches all seven of her sons be martyred in front of her. And Catholics know this story, and Orthodox know this story from the book 2 Maccabees, where in the time of the Maccabees, centuries before Christ, this woman has to endure this martyrdom of her seven sons. That story, though, was copied, as we would say in modern times, plagiarized by Jewish rabbis and put into a different context in the Roman Empire and inserted into the Talmud. So what you have is people saying, well, the Talmud gives us the list of the correct books of the Jewish canon. The Talmud also copied this story from 2 Maccabees and gave a fake version of the story to the Jews to believe forever after. You find this in Jewish scholarship. They talk about it. Again, just look up The Woman with Seven Sons and they'll describe this as a...
How do we know that was plagiarized by the Jews, or how do we know that it wasn't plagiarized by the...
You don't know. I mean, that gets into a question of how you can know any early story is true, of course. But this one, the plagiarizing is obvious. You can just put the two stories side by side. and see what's gone on. And then, as I say, the Jewish scholarship is where I find this. The Jews will talk about this. They describe it as a chronological shift where the story is just moved from the ancient history of the Maccabees to what was then the current day, the Roman Empire. And so they give a Roman Empire version of this story out there, but it's basically, it's the same plot, right? It's a stolen plot that's been copied and is a plagiarized version. Whether you can believe the original story is still an open question, right? That's another question. But this plagiarization, again, the Jewish scholarship discusses it in detail. It's just that in the context of what book the Christian should be accepting, I never find this discussed, not by Protestants, not by Catholics. I only found it because I wanted to know what the Jews had to say. And so it's one piece of what I'm trying to present to people of like, well, that's an interesting question of whether or not this Jewish list that comes long after Christ and excludes 2 Maccabees is really a list we ought to be relating to when it stole this story, etc. That's, I leave it to the reader, make your own determination, but it's an interesting fact that it doesn't seem is known to anybody. I've not met anyone, Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish even, who knows what I'm talking about when I discuss this, but it's right there in the Jewish scholarship. Just look it up.
All right, so I'm getting ready to do, and pardon the term, shotgun blast, a bunch of questions, thoughts, and statements that have come to my mind while we've been talking. I've been listening to you very intently, but and attentively also, but I still have a lot of questions that I was kind of formulating before the interview. Actually, a lot of this comes from just things that I question on myself on a daily basis. Sure. But before we continue, I'll let everybody know, please go switch your cell phone service to Patriot Mobile. When you go to patriotmobile.com/WWFA, you get a free month, but you also switch your service to a company that puts faith, family, and our Constitution first by switching to them. So, Matthew, I watch again. And this is not going to be in any order either. So, shotgun blast and not in any order. I watched a lot of the show Ancient Aliens, and a lot of people go, "Oh, you believe in aliens." Well, actually, no. I watch it because they do a lot of in-depth studies on civilizations that were thousands of years ago, and you look at how these brick structures were created using these 10,000-ton stones with perfect precision, and then around that same time period is when they're writing all these books, these biblical books, and we're hearing about, well, this is true, that's not true, and the Romans controlled history, and of course history is controlled or written by the victors, and then there's Jesus, and nobody was actually there to know whether he was really existed, but there's all these books on it, and there's all this proof, and then from that time period, there's a lot going on. I mean, we know, historically, we can see evidence of these concrete structures. We can see the paintings. We're finding these writings in these clay pots. And again, I'm summarizing everything, in these caves, and we're seeing all this historical, physical historical data. And we know if we go to Israel, we see proof of all of this stuff culminating. We see proof of the Muslims capturing Israel and creating their temple on top of the other the Christian temples. A lot going on. And then from this, we've got 2,000 years of other religions coming into play, the Catholic Bible being written, King James version. What Bibles did not get included in today's Christian Bibles, and then we see these other Bibles like the Ethiopian Bible that is now claims other 22 other books that weren't included, and were those books excluded from Christian faith because they didn't make the Catholic point of view or the Catholic narrative. So the Catholic Church excluded some books that didn't keep the narrative going, and then we have the Book of Mormon. I'm unpacking a lot on you, I know, and throwing it at you, but I know in your legal mind you're taking it all in, and I'm kind of redirecting your thought and connecting your book back, by the way, to listeners who go, there's a lot going on here. How do we know what's true, what's not true, especially today's when we see the narratives, we see politics being interwoven with religion. and the narratives are actually not only changing our faith a little bit, they're molding Christianity with the way, politicians are molding narratives to kind of recreate Christianity in their own way for the purpose of control, I believe. And then lastly, our founding fathers, that's why they did not want a church run, a state run church. I believe they wanted politics in our country. I mean, religion in our country. They just didn't want a state religion for the purpose of control. Let's unpack all that. I know I threw a lot at you, Matthew, but I know it sounds like a lot, but I know you're kind of like probably already got it figured out.
It only sounds like a lot. It actually all gets back to the same point, which is, what does the evidence actually show? You start with the evidence. You're talking ancient aliens or anything else. You look at the evidence, and then you start trying to explain what it means, and people will offer you different explanations. Whether that's mainstream science or fringe science or whatever, but you'll get different narratives about what the evidence is. It's essentially just what a jury does in any trial. You search through the evidence first, then you listen to the explanations, then you make a decision. And the explanations are always competing. There's always different versions. What is the best explanation for what the evidence shows you? So to answer any question, you start with the evidence. And in my case, with this Christianity, I started with the very basic question of, is Christianity true? Did Jesus Christ raise from the dead? That's been covered in many books. Case for Christ by Lee Strobel being the big seller, but he's basically referring to a whole bunch of scholarship that you can also go out and read and read the scholarship on it and try to determine whether or not we really have historical evidence for that event, that it really did occur, etc. That's the question that I was struggling with as this question of what is the correct Bible came up. And all I was doing was basically looking at the evidence at the same time and trying to come up with one consistent answer. That's what I'm trying to stress in my book. That's the Crossfire that I'm talking about. But no matter what these questions are, they all come back to that simple question, the simple process of start with the evidence, then listen to the arguments, then make your decision. And as I say, you'll have conflicting arguments. Always listen to both sides. The literal definition of a judge or a jury is somebody who's smart enough not to listen to one side's lawyer. They listen to both sides, and then they make their decision at the end, right? And that's a key decision-making process and something I use in my own life. And it's a discipline. You have to force yourself to do all that work, but you will find that decisions become a lot easier after you do that. The other thing I'd say about what you're talking about, the theft of the true message is actually, although it wasn't why I was reading this earliest Christian discussion, but that is the obsession of the earliest Christians. They were facing massive persecution, but being tortured and killed actually was less of a fear to these people than losing the true gospel of Christ, losing the true message, because there were all these people trying to steal the message, trying to say Christ really said something else. He did this. And all of these earliest Christians had the same answer to all of this. What is true? What did Christ really talk about? The answer is to go back in time to the original teaching. It is to try to go straight back to the original teaching of Christ and the apostles. And again, look at the evidence, follow the evidence back. So I mentioned Irenaeus earlier. Irenaeus was one telling everybody, go to any church in the world, hear what they have to say. And as you go to all the churches, you'll notice that certain things are consistent. And that will drive you back to the original message. That was part of what these people were terrified of, was that there was no way to stop a fraud from going out and preaching, oh, no, I have the real gospel of Christ. It's completely different. Go here, look at this, accept this. So the question is, which ones were true? Which ones are false? How do you determine that? The answer is to look at the evidence and try to get back to the original message.
So where do we find Irenaeus? What book was Irenaeus in? Where is he referenced with all this evidence?
Irenaeus wrote 2 books. You can read them for yourself. One of them is called Against Heresies, and the other is called Demonstration of the Apostolic Preaching. So in both cases, he's fighting heresies, and he's trying to show you what the original teachings were. And he is writing, I think, in 177 or 180 AD, something like that. That is very early by historical standards of where we have evidence of what the true original teachings were. And Irenaeus learned from Polycarp, who learned from John. So he is one step removed from the actual apostles. And he is writing in depth about what is heresy, what isn't, what is true, what is not, what the true apostles taught. So he is just crucial to this case for Christ. And as I say, he's also talking about these books that you don't find in the Protestant Bible. That's where the Crossfire comes in. And I discuss it. I have like a 50-page discussion in my book on Irenaeus and what he means to the case for Christ, and whether or not you really could prove Christ rose from the dead if your view is that he was mistaken or wrong about the book of Baruch. Readers can make their own decisions, but I go through what I see in the evidence. But he's a wonderful witness because he writes very early and in such enormous depth on the topic of heresy and, as I say, what the apostles actually preached.
I wonder how his book was preserved. I mean, I'd love to get it.
Yeah, no, he actually wrote a lot more. That's all. We only have the 2 books from him plus scraps of other writings, but a lot of his stuff was actually destroyed. But they are available. They're even available online. You don't even have to buy them if you don't want to. But definitely check out Irenaeus. He is crucial to everything we think about the true Christianity, because, as I say, he's one of the very earliest writers we have. He's only one step removed from John. We have a couple of writings from people who are right there, like, obviously Luke was one step from Paul, right? We have writings from that time frame, but they're not very specific and hard to pin down what those people are reading from in terms of the canon, what they are reading from as documents. It's Irenaeus that really, sheds light on what the earliest church did. So he's
This is the first I'm hearing about Irenaeus.
Yeah.
So Irenaeus referred to Jesus having a brother. Is that what I heard you say earlier?
No. Protestants claim that that James is a true brother of Christ. He's referred to as a brother of the Lord in the Bible. But whether that's the old school Hebraic meaning of the word brother, and whether you should interpret that to mean biological brother or a cousin or a stepbrother or just a brother is very much an open question. But people debate that. But he is referred to as a brother of the Lord in the Bible. And then, like I say, whether that means biological brother or not is debated.
Well, now, and that is another question, because a lot of people say Jesus did not have any siblings. They'll say Jesus did not ever get married. And so, of course, there's other books that I guess are discrepancies, have discrepancies about that were excluded or included in other Bibles. So why do you think the church excluded certain Bibles or certain books from the Bible? Why do you, and let's,
so that goes back to Irenaeus. That goes back to exactly what Irenaeus is saying. He's saying that there are these other gospels floating around, but you'll notice that none of the churches in all the world are teaching them, that it's these false preachers.
But he wrote this like thousands of years, 1,000, 2,000 years before other Bibles were written, though.
Exactly. But he's telling you that the 4 gospels are the real gospels. So he is the core witness to saying, yes, there are these other gospels floating around, but those are fake. These are the ones that are true. These are the ones that John and the apostles taught from. And he's one step removed from John. So he's crucial to that evidentiary question of, what does the evidence show about all these gospels? Which ones are true? Which ones are false? Should we just accept all of them? Should we limit ourselves to 4, etc.? Irenaeus is at the absolute center of that discussion.
So what about like when you get into the Proverbs and and all these other feel good books of the Bible? So those really shouldn't be in the Bible. Is that what I'm hearing?
No. That gets into a question of what the Old Testament is, right? And that's exactly what my book is covering in 500 pages of details. What is the evidence that we have the real Old Testament as Jesus and the apostles thought of it? And that's where I look at 3 different pieces of evidence. What do the Jews say about these books at that time? What is the modern Jewish scholarship? What does it say about those books at that time? What do the earliest Christians say about those books? And what does the Bible itself possibly say about those books? Just look at those 3 pieces of evidence. That's what I cover, and try to figure out what was the true original Old Testament as Jesus and the apostles taught it, as opposed to what we might think of it or others might claim it is, right? That could just be wrong. The question is, what does the historical evidence say about this? And focus on that.
Well, to summarize, what did those groups say about those other books or about the books?
Yeah, my view is that they're quite clear that these extra books that the Catholics accept were part of the teachings of the real Jesus and the apostles. That the actual, physical person, Jesus, and the physical person in the of the various apostles, those people did accept these books and preach from those books.
So
But I
even
leave it
though
to the reader. I'm just all I do is put the evidence out there.
exactly,
The reader can
so
make their own
the
determination.
four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the real books. So when they go
Exactly.
into the other Bibles in the New Testament, those are not real, but they were accepted as being teachings. Is there a nuance there that I'm missing?
Well, no, they're. Are you talking about the epistles? You mean, or
Yeah, all the different yeah, like
yeah,
Psalms and stuff like that.
yeah. So my view is that the evidence supports the Protestant Bible plus the books that the Catholics accept. Therefore, the Catholic Bible.
Okay.
But there are other books outside of that that I would say are excluded. That's not really the topic of my book, but I did look into the evidence for all of this, and my view is that the evidence for other books is not sufficient, and doesn't necessarily prove that they were teachings of the apostles. Although in some cases you may find books that were taught by one apostle but not by all the apostles. I think that's the case with 1 Enoch, for example. But you get into debates over who accepted what, and this leads into a whole discussion that again is not really the topic of my book. My book is just an evidentiary review. But why do we have a canon that defines what's in the Bible? Why do we cut off? Have a firm cutoff that says this is scripture, that isn't. Why is it not sort of a fading tail and descending down? That's a whole theological discussion of what a Bible is. There's actually a technological element. This all comes up in the early church because for the first time you have a book, what they call a codex, but two covers with straight paper rather than rolled up scrolls. So until then it had just been like a room full of scrolls. So this technological change leads to why people want to have one book that they limit all the scriptures to, etc. And that gets into a question of whether or not that's appropriate. Who gets to make that decision? Is that something where we defer to a church? Is that something that we each individually make, etc.? Those are more theological questions. I don't address them in my book, but if you start with the evidence, as I try to do with the book, you then face all of these philosophical, theological questions, right? As you move up the food chain and make your own determinations in this world.
So let's take the Catholic Bible, and not to attack the Catholic Church on this, but simply as a historical. The Catholic Church does not accept certain books.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of books that they excluded, and like Enoch. I'd love you to talk about Enoch for a minute, kind of thing. But why other books were excluded? Were they excluded because they did not fit the narrative of the Catholic faith, or were they excluded because they did not fit the true teachings of Jesus and the apostles? And then those books that were excluded, the books of the Apocrypha, or the 22 books that are in the Ethiopian Bible that are not in the Catholic version, or other Protestant versions of the Bible, do you think that while they might not have been considered teachings, that they are actually historical proof to back up the other books of the Bibles? Your thoughts?
Yeah. So first off, there's kind of a distinction that you're making that the Catholics, and particularly these early Christians who would claim to be Catholic, or Catholics claim as their own in the earliest church, wouldn't see. So you're saying, well, is it because the apostles taught them, or is it because they wanted to preserve, these doctrines? Like they're saying the doctrines come back, are derived from the apostles, that it's all coming down through one church. So they would say that they're all consistent with one another. To me, originally, I wrote this book. I mean, I do end up Catholic in the end, but I wrote this book in the sort of as if I was going back in time to my original self that was a skeptic looking into this. This is a evidentiary question. That's a claim that the Catholics are making, whereas the Protestants are making a claim that it's more along the lines of what you're saying, which is that, well, there was the original teaching and then these doctrines lead to these books later. Well, which one of those claims is true? That's where it says, to me, it's a simple legal investigation, just like a trial. look at the evidence, then listen to the Catholics and the Protestants argue about their two different narratives of what history really entails, and then make a decision. Did these books come first and then the doctrines come later? Or did the doctrines come first and the books come later? And to me, the evidence points in one direction. You can make your own determinations. But the answer to that dispute is an evidentiary research project and into, as I say, into what does the evidence actually show. Again, I looked into what do the Jews say about the books, what did the earliest church say about the books, and what does the Bible possibly say about the books. Then I present it to the reader in my book, Canon Crossfire, and people can then make their own determinations. But to me, you start with the evidence. You should fully understand the evidence, then listen to both sides debate, then make your own conclusion as to which of those is
So
true.
basically, what I'm hearing in in a very simplistic form is that the doctrines that created the Catholic Bible or other Protestant Bibles, the doctrines are what held the books together that made those Bibles. It wasn't the narrative of the of the Catholic Church or the narrative of a Protestant church that said, "Oh, we're going to go pick Bibles that fit our narrative." Instead, they said, "Oh, the doctrine of the teachings of Christ that, for the past 1,000 years or 500 years or whenever it was they created those Bibles, those doctrines are consistent in these books. Those doctrines are the thread that hold these books together. So we're taking that common thread and making a Bible out of it. And the other Bibles that didn't make it weren't because they didn't fit a narrative or wasn't a nefarious reason to say, oh no, it's got something in it that I don't believe in, that we don't believe in, so we're going to keep it out." They said, "Oh no, the doctrine, the doctrine thread that holds these books together is consistent and makes our Bible." Did I hear that right?
Exactly. So the earliest Christians, as they're making these decisions or debating this topic, I guess I should say, as we go through time, they're all saying these are the books the apostles taught, right? That these are the books we were handed down. Therefore, this is our Bible. Therefore, these are our doctrines. They're not saying these are our doctrines. Therefore, this is our Bible. Therefore, we will, claim or falsely claim that these are the ones that were handed down, etc. So again, it's an evidentiary inquiry of which came first and whether the books were there before the doctrines, whether the books were there before these people are talking, because people will quote a later father like Athanasius or Jerome, and they'll say, well, this is what he said. They're not the first Christians. What did the earlier Christians say? What did the very earliest ones say? And as I say, the guy who's crucial to that analysis is Irenaeus, one step removed. And what does he say about these books? Well, he's saying that the four Gospels are the four Gospels. So when you get down to Jerome and Athanasius saying, well, we have four Gospels, they are correct about what the history was because we have Irenaeus to show us the history, etc.
So let's talk about
that kind of analysis.
So let's talk about two books that pop in my mind that have unique thoughts. We'll say that might not resemble teachings. Book of Enoch, one, and the Book of Psalms. Can you comment on those two as they fit into the Bible or don't fit into the Bible?
Yeah, so the Book of Psalms is accepted, right? It's in Protestant Bibles, Catholic Bibles, Orthodox Bibles as one of the books that Jesus and the apostles were teaching from in the earliest days. 1 Enoch is generally not included in any of their Bibles, although it is included in a subset of Orthodox on the Ethiopian side, would include 1 Enoch. But 1 Enoch is clearly referenced by Jude in the Epistle of Jude as prophecy. So he says, that the prophet Enoch said these words that we then find in the book 1 Enoch. I go through in my book a lot of attempts that are made to claim that doesn't mean that he thought 1 Enoch was scripture. I don't find any of them to be, particularly persuasive or make a lot of sense when you look through all the evidence. I think it's fairly clear that he did think it. And to me, one of the clear determinations on the canon is can somebody overrule Jude and say, well, Jude was mistaken? And we don't find 1 Enoch necessarily referenced in the other books of the Bible. It may be that there was a dispute among apostles. We see disputes in the book of Acts between Peter and Paul. We shouldn't be surprised to find disputes. and we find a mechanism for resolving those disputes. And it could be that one Enoch was just, was disputed and was ultimately excluded. But what I don't find persuasive is the claim that, well, yes, he says something about Enoch, but that's not really a reference to one Enoch. That doesn't mean that he accepted it. If you break those down and compare it to other arguments made, again, in the case for Christ about other books, etc., you will find that those arguments don't really hold up very well. I personally don't accept them. I think it's fairly clear that Jude himself must have believed that book was real.
So you believe that the Enoch book 1 has relevancy or has truth?
Well, it has some relevancy to Jude, whether it's true scripture, completely divinely inspired, etc. Gets into this question of, can Jude be overruled? Who overrules them? How does that work? Is that authentic? And that gets into whether you have divine inspiration for the church, etc. I mean, those are all the questions that start coming up as you work your way through this.
Two quick questions: the relevance or importance of Jude, even though he wasn't in the original Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, like you talked about earlier, the original books. But and then for the people in the back, a brief summary of Enoch chapter 1.
Yeah, so Jude is in the Protestant and Catholic Bibles. He is accepted on the same level as the Gospels, as one of the early documents of the early church. But it's a strange document. It actually parallels another epistle, which I'm spacing on which one it is, but they're very similar, except for some of these little discrepancies, like one Enoch, as we say. And the general feeling is that the reason Jude was retained, like, why would anyone bother to keep this odd document that seems to parallel these other epistles, is because the thought is that it did come from a relative of Jesus. Jude is identified as a brother of James. I think he says that in the epistle. In fact, I am Jude, the brother of James. The thought is that is James, who is referred to as a brother of the Lord, which would make Jude some cousin or biological brother of Christ himself, and maybe that's why they kept it. So that's why it's there. It makes this odd reference to one Enoch, which, as you say, is an interesting book in itself. It goes on and on. It pretends or is a book from Enoch, giving forth prophecies, and it references the Epistle of Jude references in 47 words taken from that first chapter of the one Enoch and its prophecy. So it is, a very interesting issue when you get down to what is the true canon. What did the apostles and Christ preach, and how do we make sense of that and go forward if you're Christian?
Again, a summary of what for the people in the back, what Enoch 1 was about.
Yeah, I mean, it's dealing with the earliest days of the world. There's stuff in there about those giants that are referred to in Genesis, I believe, etc. Like there's a lot in there about prophecies, angels, and how angels worked, etc. And it definitely has a role in early Christianity. The question of whether it would be scripture or not is the question here for the canon, right?
Kind of goes back to the Ancient Aliens, which the reason why I watch Ancient Aliens isn't because of the alien aspect as much as it is for the historical aspect of the civilizations that they talk about during those times. But Psalms, who wrote Psalms?
So my understanding is that people don't know technically who wrote Psalms. That there was claims that it was David, but that could mean like inspired by David as opposed to being David for some of them, etc. So usually I find in Bible commentaries, people debate who wrote what particular Psalms, which ones might have actually come from David, which ones might have come from other people. Some of them I think might have come from Solomon, etc. So it's a mixed collection of Psalms and preserved and arguably, again, Protestants, Catholics, etc., would argue that that is the collection that Jesus and the apostles were teaching from.
So I want to ask you a couple other questions about that are more relevant to politics and, like I said earlier, founding fathers. And then I want to pivot back to your book and kind of make the connection on how your book may reflect some of this stuff, even though I know your book is more of a spiritual journey that you told us about in the beginning of the interview. But to sidestep for a minute, because I really believe that what we see today historically, has been a blend of religion and morals, and our Constitution is a reflective of morals, and I believe that freedom runs in our DNA, and that our Creator has really inspired a lot of documents throughout history that not only guide us in a moral character, but then politics kind of creeps in on it. And just to get your perspective, I know it's not what your book is about, but to get your perspective, because you've been kind of researching this, and you have to at some point go on all your research and your time into this book, things had to pop out politically speaking, like, oh wow, this happened 2 years ago, or this happened during this administration, this happened, and it's a reflection of something that you may have read in one of the other books that's not in the Bible, or was it Irenaeus? You said Irenaeus, right? So let's talk about that. What do you think about how religion and politics have been intertwined with each other, especially recently, and of course through history they always have been? But what is your comment on the founding fathers, who I believe when they wrote our Constitution, did not just say, hey, we're great thinkers of our time and everything is a reflection of now. They were also historians and philosophers, and they actually studied ancient books written during the time of some of the time periods that we're referring to. They studied books from Greece, and Rome and all these other areas, but to write the Bible. And when they said that there shall not be a state religion, people take that as that, separation of church and state is that there should not be any religion. What are your comments, or what are your thoughts tying, your knowledge from your book into what I'm just now talking about, politics and narratives and everything happening today?
So, as I mentioned, the early church is a martyr church. The first 300 years of Christianity are astonishingly violent. There's about 10 what are called fathers, earliest Christians, who wrote extensively, and they get quoted throughout my book or any other book on the early church. And I just, as an outsider, didn't know anything about these people, right? I'd never heard of Irenaeus, etc. I would Google who these people were and what happened to them, and I realized that 7 out of the 10 were martyred. They were tortured and killed for their beliefs. Only 3 of the 10 managed to escape that fate. That is how serious the persecution was in the early church. And that all ends with something called the Edict of Milan, which is a decree by the Roman Empire to give freedom of religion to everybody. And that has parallels to our Constitution in that it gives freedom of religion. It also has a possible parallel in that it's long ago, has no application, and does not prevent any form of persecution. And the question we face as Americans as we go forward in time is how serious is that protection in the Constitution? Will it be continually defended? Because you can lose your rights. Everyone had a right to freedom of religion under this Edict of Milan, and they all lost it over time because the Roman Empire fell, etc. So to me, that's one lesson, is that you only have your rights while you can define them, or while you can defend them. The second thing I would say, somewhat related to that though, is things can read beautifully to someone. Like I hear all the time people along the lines of what you're saying, the beauty of the First Amendment and the wisdom of protecting freedom of religion, etc. But as a lawyer, that doesn't mean anything if the wrong people are making determinations as to what that document actually says, etc. I just talk about abortion, don't care what anyone's view is, or not the topic today, but in my own life, when I was born, there was no right to an abortion in the U.S. Constitution. Shortly thereafter, the Supreme Court said there was an absolute right to abortion that could not be infringed in any way. By the time I was an adult, you could restrict it slightly. By now, there is no longer a right enshrined in the Constitution, and it can actually be eliminated. Not one word of the Constitution changed. You could talk about the Constitution till you're blue in the face. The fact is that what it says and what is actually defended, it relies on judges. It relies on the people who appoint those judges. And we only have our rights as long as we're willing to stand up for them. And there is just a lot of stuff going on in this world that is paraded or promoted as if it is about freedom of religion, but is actually eliminating religion, as you alluded to and spoke of. But like you'll find in other places where they're banning public prayer, and they say, well, that's about freedom of religion because your prayer in public offends somebody else. And then they got to a point where now they're banning private, silent prayer. You were just standing there praying to yourself. Well, that offended the people around you. So they ban that, etc. Like they will claim that they are doing these things for religious purposes, to protect religion. But of course they aren't. They're actually persecuting the Christians and others who want to engage in silent prayer, etc. So you have to be careful about these things. They're always sold as if it's a good thing. That no one sells it as persecution. It just ends up as persecution because people weren't paying attention and people didn't know what was really going to happen to them under these laws and these changes. And that, to me, it's that vigilance about what's going on and trying to get to the real truth of those laws that are being proposed, et cetera, that I just worry that people are not vigilant enough, that people are too accepting of these things. And an unfortunate element of this, particularly in a pluralistic society like ours, is that sometimes it's Christians who are the worst part of this, because you look at some other Christian and say, well, that's not my belief, and therefore that person is just being unreasonable. And so you'll see things like restrictions around the world on wearing religious paraphernalia, that they ban that as offensive to other people. And you'll find Christians who say, well, I don't have to wear a crucifix. I don't have to wear, a funny outfit or this sort of thing. So I think it's perfectly okay to ban that. But that is the persecution of your fellow Christian who does believe that he is called to do that. You should be cognizant of that, and that, you're allowing those rights to be trampled is ultimately going to be a problem for you, because you just lost allies who would have stood up for you, et cetera. Like, don't allow the persecution to start is sort of my advice from having read about this early church.
This is quite interesting. I've talked about this before in a different way, but you're right. It's almost like the narratives have successfully separated not just, let's just say, conservatives from liberals, not just Christians from Muslims, but they've actually have successfully separated Christians from other Christians that may have been better in a fight at a later time.
Exactly.
With on each other's side.
And don't for one second think that any of that's accidental either. Like, that is intentional.
Right. No, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, no, and I've talked about that regularly, because when we really look at the dividing us, the right divides us up amongst ourselves as much as the left divides up the members of the left up. And I hate to be left and right and political about it, but just for to make it something very simple, a simple analogy here, we're not only separated in big groups, we're chopped up into smaller groups for the purpose of control. And I believe it eventually removes religion from the conservative, right-leaning Christian side as much as it has removed it from the left-leaning, liberal side. So let's go back to your book. While you're writing your book, did any of today's narratives, anything has gone on in our country, was any of that reflected in your book, or did you take any of that philosophy, knowing what's happened today, and saying, here is how the narratives and politics are changing religion today? When I go back into a historical perspective in the writing of your book, were you thinking, well, I'm looking at how they do it today because I'm here living in this today's time? When I write my book and I look up these other books, Irenaeus, whoever, were those same procedures used in those times? Did you have any reflection of today on your book about yesterday?
Absolutely. And as I say, it really gets back to what is the true gospel message, because what you find in both eras, the early church and today, is people trying to tell you, well, Jesus would say, turn the other cheek. Jesus would say, you should be understanding of other people, therefore you should not pray silently and offend them. Jesus would say this. Jesus would say that. Did he say that, actually? Do you mind if we look and see what he really said and consider everything he said, et cetera? That fake message is prevalent at all times, but very prevalent in times of persecution. And what you will find is that people will be saying, you're just being unreasonable, that there's a kind of Christianity that doesn't accept, that doesn't hold your view, that you need to stand up for yourself and your rights, etc. So you're just being unreasonable, and we don't have any problem throwing you in jail or doing far worse, particularly in the early church, etc. And that's the thing that is, like I say, is almost more horrifying than anything else. It is finding the actual Christian message distorted and used against you. And you see that again, not that, whatever people's views are on abortion, but the point is, you will find nowadays, I know I saw online a woman Protestant minister claiming that God was with her as she went in for her 2 abortions, and she never felt more in tune with God than when her abortions occurred. That is not remotely the message, of course, of the Catholic Church and certain evangelicals, etc. But the point is that you have a group of Christians who are not sympathetic to, say, those who silently pray outside of an abortion clinic, and will claim that you're just mistaken, you're wrong, that's not the true Christianity. It's just that you will find that message being used against you, and it's horrifying to see it and to encounter it, and to realize that in some cases this persecution is going to come from Christians who, just see the other Christian as unreasonable and worthy of being thrown in jail, etc., for something as simple as silently praying.
So that Protestant minister that had the abortions that you referred to, maybe she's confusing her feeling like she was with God to feeling like she thought she was God in the ability to take away a life, and she was really trying to feel like she was a God instead of feeling like she was with God. I'm not trying to make a joke out of it, but it's that's people who think different things, I guess.
And I always point this out to people. There is a book written in the 1970s that people just don't seem to go out and get, but it will show you that there are possibly 5 times in the New Testament that Jesus condemns abortion. And I don't really care. Just as like I said, as a lawyer who looks into these things, I don't really care what someone's view is on that topic, as long as you know that it exists and have read the scholarship. I'm amazed how no one knows it exists and doesn't read the scholarship. So you'll talk to people about this and they'll say, well, this, that, or the other thing. It's like, well, do you actually know at least an argument over how the Bible should be interpreted, etc.? Like, I'm just amazed that people do so little research into things. Like, go find what the scholarship is, go find what the evidence is first, and then tell me what your view of the Bible is. Don't argue with me when you haven't even read my, the evidence or my side of the argument, etc. Like, that's just showing that you don't know what you're talking about on what you claim is the most important topic in the world, which is what Jesus preached, right?
So same question asked a little bit differently, and then I want you to wrap up another brief summary of your book before we close out. So when you were getting the information and doing the research on your book, and you're looking back at the days when the woman who had her 7 children martyred, that story was stolen by the Jews at the time, and you look at what was going on then, do you see some of the same tactics that are being used today to destroy Christianity, destroy faith in America or even worldwide, tactics that are being used on a political level to change narratives, to change faith or religion or the truth, true stories? Did you see those same tactics being used in your research back then during those days when you were gathering your research?
Absolutely. It's just cycles of persecution. And the cycle, the persecution comes in basically 3 varieties. There's criminal acts that people engage in. The state doesn't allow it, but somehow it still occurs as people attack the religious or their facilities, etc. Then you have the state persecution that occurs where the government actually comes after you for something and is trying to force you to comply. And when you don't comply, the penalties just get worse and worse. And then there's the third, which is this stealing of the message that kind of occurs out there, and the co-opting of the government elements by the people who are stealing the message, etc. And all of that exists in the earliest days of the church. It continues today, but it's, it occurred in France, in Mexico, in Spain. It's occurred in, Japan and Korea and China. Nothing is new. These things have gone on and on throughout our history. And I find it very uplifting to read what these people wrote. As I say, 7 of 10 of them went to their own deaths. What did they say about facing persecution and martyrdom? What did they preach to their congregations who were going to face persecution and martyrdom? And ultimately, as I say, some of these people, you get to read their last words as they're being dragged off to this. What did they say? I find it uplifting to know that they believed, that they absolutely felt that they had the truth on their side, etc. Is a key part of why you should believe that Christianity is true. And as a Christian who fears that we might face persecution, I found it very uplifting to read their words.
Did you reference the 7 out of 10 in your book?
Yeah, it's my book. It's actually a dedication to my book. I dedicate it to the martyrs of the early church, because when you find scholars talking about these things, they'll say, well, he just cited some book. He just did this. Like, he cited a book on his way to his death.
Right.
Let's give the man his due here. Like, he believed what he said or whatever. Like, they're sort of flippant about, well, he just mentioned it in a book. Like, yeah, but he's about to be tortured and killed over what he just wrote. So, I just, there's so many haunting things when you go through it. But there's so I mentioned Irenaeus learned from Polycarp, who learned from John. John, of course, writes the book of Revelations, and in it, there's a letter to the church in Smyrna. Polycarp might have been the head of the church in Smyrna when that letter's written. And so John is, in the book of Revelations, he got this letter to Smyrna that might be to Polycarp saying, hold fast to the faith unto death, and you will, I think it's something like, you will inherit the crown of heaven, something to that effect. And then you get to read about Polycarp going to his death and remaining truthful to the faith in his martyrdom, right? So there's all these haunting connections between these things. You'll read letters between Ignatius and Polycarp, both of whom are martyred, 2 martyrs talking to one another. You'll read Cyprian preaching to, it's called an exhortation to martyrdom. He's preaching to his congregation about how to face martyrdom. And then you read about Cyprian going to his martyrdom. And you read in a different document about the congregation going to its martyrdom. Like, it's just all these interconnections I found, just like I said, very fascinating, but also very spiritually uplifting to see a church that faced this and how it dealt with it, and how, this too shall pass.
That was in those times, that was hard faith like that. Like, you had to really be faithful because you're about to die. Today, we got easy faith. You go to Sunday if you want to go to church or whatever.
This is a key thing about me and how I came to my journey that I just see so differently when I interact with others. But I am reading about people who became Christian knowing full well that the result of becoming Christian was to be tortured and killed. And I am reading as they become Christian, as they convert. And here I am discussing whether or not I think Christianity is true and will I become a Christian. Like, that's so different from this, come down to my church. We have beautiful singing, and, everyone finds it spiritually uplifting. And we have a basketball program your kids will like. And we have this, that. Like, it's so different.
And after mass, we're going to have donuts and talk about how, great everything is. While we're having donuts and coffee, exactly. Back then it was become a Christian and die.
Exactly.
And in a horrible way, by the way.
And they did. And there's also, I mentioned this on a different interview, and I'm, again, one of the things that I'm amazed that people have forgotten about history, but in Algeria, during the Roman Empire days, there was a group that was told in no uncertain terms, if you go to church on this Sunday, the troops will be there to drag you off to your torture and execution. 50 of them went to church. That is how important going to church on Sundays was. They went to church knowing what was coming. And imagine that in today's world where, we saw with COVID and everything else. I mean, people shut down, people watch church on TV rather than go to church, etc. Like, it's a different church. When you read about the earliest days of Christianity, and it makes you wonder when you're sitting in a modern church of, when
driving to Sunday mass or Sunday service, when you're in your car that, you've had a good lifestyle in, and you're from your home and everything's going great and peachy, and you don't have to worry about showing up and dying.
Exactly. And would
Yeah.
you show up if he did? Like, that's what I'm always wondering. Like, how many people here would show up if that was the edict? Like, I don't think any of us would, sadly. And
One Well, one last summary on your book for people who might want who hearing this information might want a little bit more to prompt them to make that they might want to read your book. Not only where to get it, but let's another little brief summary in connecting our conversation today back to your book and to tell others about it.
yeah, so the book's Canon Crossfire, Canon of Scripture, Canon, crossfire.com. That's my website. That'll send you to the cheapest place to buy it. I have large print books, audio books, ebooks, printed books, whatever people want to buy, all available for you there. And the focus of the book is just a research project. I wanted to know, what do the Jews say about these books that the Catholics accept and Protestants don't? What did the Bible possibly allude to them? Where's all of that? I just wanted to read it for myself, and I wanted to know what every Christian in the earliest church ever said about those books. All I wanted to know was what that was, what that body of evidence is. That's what I show in my book. I leave decisions to the reader, but the point is that to me, all decisions should start from reviewing all the evidence first, then listen to the arguments, then make the decision. So that's why I did the research, and now that I did, I knew I had to get it out there for others. So anyone else who wants to know, I present it to you, so you can now find all that out in the matter of a few hours to a few days.
Matthew, Mark, I love that. It's not a way to, I love how you're doing it not as a way to indoctrinate people to think like you. You're doing it as a body of evidence to say, here's what my hard work did that made it work for me and made me a believer and made me more, ingrained or concreted in your faith. And as a result, you're just offering that body of evidence to other people. I absolutely love that. And I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And
God bless. Happy to be here. Happy to finally join you as Christians.
absolutely. Well, hang on there 1 second while I thank everybody else for not only listening to the podcast today, but remember, if you listen to the podcast, it's also on Rumble and YouTube or vice versa. And I'd appreciate if you shared the interview with somebody else. Not only do I think it's a lot of really good information, but if you think it's good information, please share it with somebody else that you think would appreciate it. And once again, thank you so much for your time. And I'll have the next show coming up later today. Thank you so much. Have a great day.